forget a private, romantic wedding night. In the Middle Ages, your drunken guests would follow you to the bedroom, strip you naked, and force you into bed with a stranger. And they wouldn't leave. They would watch, listen, and wait for the one thing that proved the marriage was real, your cry of pain, and the blood on the sheets. In the jaundiced light of dawn, filtering through the narrow castle windows, the silence was almost absolute. The feast was over. Its human debris, drunken knights slumped in high-backed chairs, their snores rattling in their armor, and servants too exhausted to clear the trestle tables, was the only testament to the night's riotous joy. The Great Hall, a space designed for celebration, was now a still life of carnage, littered with gnawed bones, overturned goblets, and the stale, cloying scent of spilled wine and wood smoke. This quiet was not peace, but the heavy, dead air that follows a great and terrible storm. But at the heart of this chaos, in the bridal chamber, a different kind of order was being imposed. To the great bed, a vast wooden structure that resembled a battlefield of tangled linens and heavy furs, several women approached. These were not the young, giggling bridesmaids of the previous evening. They were older, stern matrons, the matriarchs and chief ladies-in-waiting from both families. Their faces were impassive, carved from the same hard stone as the castle walls, their movements deliberate and stripped of all emotion. They had not come to congratulate, but to inspect and to verify. Without a single word, they drew back the heavy bed curtains, letting the cold morning air wash over the two figures huddled beneath the covers. Then, with a slow, synchronized movement, they pulled back the furs and blankets. They did not look at the pale, exhausted faces of the newlyweds. Their focus was singular, their gaze directed downward, searching not for signs of life or love, but for proof of a transaction completed. They were there to witness the evidence, the physical consummation of a political and economic contract that had been negotiated for months. And there it was. On the coarse linen sheet, at the very center of the bed's vast landscape, was a dark, undeniable stain. It was not a large mark, but its significance was immense, a crude splash of crimson and other fluids that spoke a language everyone present understood. This was not merely a piece of soiled bedding. It was a document, signed in blood and seed, the final, binding clause in an alliance of property and power. It was the seal upon a dynastic merger, a brutal but necessary piece of public record that would be spoken of in whispers for days to come. One of the older women, the groom's mother, nodded curtly. The inspection was complete. The two other matrons then carefully, methodically, began to remove the sheet from the bed. They folded it with a strange reverence, as if it were not a piece of cloth but a banner captured in a decisive battle. They ensured the stained portion was folded inward, preserving the evidence from casual view, protecting the integrity of their trophy. The bride flinched as their cold, indifferent hands brushed against her bare skin, but she remained silent, a passive object in this final, humiliating act of her own wedding. With the sheet secured, the women turned and left the chamber as silently as they had entered. They carried the folded linen before them, a sacred relic to be presented to the waiting fathers and uncles, the final confirmation that the dynasty was secure and the virgin territory had been claimed. Behind them, they left a silence that was heavier and more profound than the one in the Great Hall. It was the silence of shame, of violation, and of the cold, stark reality that in their world, the most intimate act between two people was never truly their own. It all began with a celebration, a spectacle of calculated joy. A medieval wedding was never a union of souls, it was a merger of territories, fortunes, and political ambitions, a complex piece of human engineering designed to consolidate power. The days leading up to the ceremony were a carefully orchestrated performance of abundance. Great halls overflowed with the bounty of the land, the air thick with the smell of roasting meats, exotic spices, and the sweet, heavy scent of mead and wine. Tournaments were held, where knights could display their prowess, their clashing steel a crude metaphor for the dynastic struggles being resolved through this union. Wine flowed like a river, its purpose not merely to fuel the revelry but to dissolve the inherent awkwardness between two powerful families, now forced into an intimate and often uneasy alliance. Minstrels sang ballads of epic love and heroic deeds, a romantic soundtrack laid over a transaction that was anything but. Every element of the feast, from the number of courses served to the quality of the tapestries hung on the walls, was a public declaration of wealth and status, a reinforcement of the importance of the contract being forged. It was a theater of prosperity, and every guest was both an audience member and a critic. At the center of this whirlwind was the bride, often a girl barely on the cusp of womanhood. She was the principal prize, a political asset whose value was calculated in acres of land, strategic alliances, and, above all, the unimpeachable purity of her bloodline. Her virginity was not a private virtue but a public commodity, the ultimate guarantee that any heir produced would be a legitimate vessel for the family's legacy. Dressed in impossibly fine silks and velvets, she was a beautiful, silent object of veneration, her every downcast glance and modest blush scrutinized for signs of the requisite innocence. Her counterpart, the groom, was frequently just as young and just as terrified, though his fear was expected to be masked by a swaggering, wine-fueled bravado. He was not merely a husband but the designated instrument of his family's future. The weight of his lineage rested upon his shoulders, and on this night, he would be called upon to prove his virility, his capacity to continue the dynasty. His performance would not be judged by his bride, but by the collective gaze of his peers and elders. He was a champion entering an arena, and failure was not an option that could be contemplated. The guests, therefore, were far more than simple observers. They were the essential witnesses, the jury whose collective presence validated the entire proceeding. Their feasting and laughter were part of the ritual, creating the public context in which the private act would be legitimized. Every nobleman, every lady, every knight, and even the highest-ranking servants understood the day's true trajectory. The vows spoken before the priest, the exchange of rings, the solemn mass, these were but the formal preamble. The real drama, the unholy climax of this holy sacrament, was set to unfold not at the altar, but in the bridal bed. As the hours wore on and the wine took its full effect, the atmosphere would subtly shift. The courtly songs of the minstrels gave way to bawdier tunes. The jokes exchanged between the men became less veiled, their laughter coarser. The glances directed at the bridal couple grew more intense, more speculative, stripped of courtesy and filled with a raw, almost predatory, anticipation. The air grew thick with a shared, unspoken understanding. The performance of civility was nearing its end, and the time for the raw, physical proof of the union was fast approaching. The celebration was slowly revealing its true, brutal purpose. This public obsession with the consummation was not born of mere prurience, it was rooted in the cold, hard logic of dynastic survival. In an age of contested claims and fragile successions, an unconsummated marriage could be annulled, rendering the entire political contract void. The public bedding ceremony was the ultimate safeguard, a crude but effective method of ensuring there could be no future dispute. The act had to be witnessed, or at least its immediate aftermath verified, to transform the couple from two separate individuals into a single, legally and biologically fused entity. It was the final, non-negotiable seal on the deal. And so, every guest knew their role. They were there to drink the wine, to eat the food, to make the noise, and then, to bear witness. Their presence was a form of social pressure, a force that would propel the nervous bride and groom from the high table to the bedchamber. They were the guardians of the tradition, the enforcers of the contract. The grand theater of the wedding feast was an elaborate, day-long prelude, all of it designed to build towards a single, raw, and inescapable moment of public humiliation, a moment that would define the rest of the couple's lives. As night fell upon the castle, a profound and transformative darkness that the sputtering torchlight seemed only to deepen, the thin, carefully maintained veneer of courtly decorum began to fracture and peel away. The wine, which had been poured with abandon for hours, had finally completed its alchemical work, transmuting forced civility into a more primal form of celebration. The laughter in the great hall grew louder, coarser, losing its musicality and taking on a sharp, almost cruel edge. The minstrels, sensing the shift in the mood, abandoned their ballads of chivalric love and struck up tunes that were far older, their rhythms heavy and overtly sexual. The very atmosphere became charged, the air thick with anticipation, as the feast moved inexorably from a display of wealth to a prelude for a public blood sport. The signal, when it came, was not subtle. It was a primal roar from one of the great lords, a fist hammered down upon the oak of the high table that made the goblets jump and rattle. This was the moment the entire day had been building towards. A wave of raw energy, a collective surge of purpose, electrified the crowd. Every head turned, every eye fixed upon the bridal couple, who suddenly ceased to be the guests of honor and became the quarry in a hunt. The noise in the hall coalesced into a single, deafening chant, a rhythmic, wordless roar that was part cheer, part demand. The time for feasting was over, the time for the ritual had come, and the crowd was baying for its commencement. What followed was not a procession, it was an abduction. The groom was seized by his companions, boisterous knights whose friendly backslapping now felt like the blows of captors. The bride was swarmed by her ladies, their nervous giggles doing little to soften the reality of their firm, insistent hands guiding her from her seat. She was engulfed by the human tide, her feet barely skimming the rush-strewn floor as she was propelled forward. All semblance of personal will was stripped away. They were no longer individuals but symbols, effigies of fertility and dynastic continuity being carried by the unstoppable momentum of tradition towards their ceremonial defilement. The journey through the castle's arteries was a descent into a sensory hell. The heat from scores of torches and hundreds of unwashed bodies created a suffocating, claustrophobic bubble of warmth. The air, already stale, was now a noxious fume of greasy smoke, sweat, spilled ale, and the cloying, heavy perfumes of the nobility. For the bride, the world dissolved into a disorienting, nightmarish blur of distorted, leering faces, mouths wide with laughter, and hands that reached out from the pressing crowd to touch her gown, her hair, as if she were a holy relic or a prize animal being led to slaughter. The wall of sound was a physical pressure, a battering ram against the skull. They moved through the familiar spaces of the castle, but the torchlight transformed them into something alien and threatening. The grand tapestries depicting heroic hunts and pious legends seemed to mock them, their woven figures twisting in the flickering light into grotesque parodies. Saints appeared to grimace, and charging boars seemed to be aiming their tusks directly at the couple. In the narrow stone-walled corridors, the sound of the mob amplified, the shouts and laughter echoing off the unyielding surfaces to create a disorienting, maddening echo chamber. Every footstep, every jeer, was magnified, trapping them in a vortex of noise and shadow. This auditory assault was not merely random noise, it was a barrage of words, each one a tiny, sharp-edged stone hurled at their dignity. The matriarchs shouted crude but practical advice about conception, their voices shrill and devoid of sympathy. The groom's peers made loud, explicit wagers on his stamina and the bride's compliance. Even the bride's own mother, her face a strange mixture of tears and grim determination, might whisper a final, desperate instruction into her daughter's ear, to be brave, to do her duty, to remember that the fate of the family rested on what was about to happen. There was no comfort, only a relentless chorus of expectation and demand. The groom, caught in his own vortex of terror, struggled to maintain a facade of drunken nonchalance. He was the focus of the masculine half of the crowd, his virility about to be publicly tested. The heavy, supposedly supportive hands of his friends on his shoulders felt like the grip of jailers, holding him upright and forcing him forward. He could feel the cold, appraising stare of his father from across the crowd, a look that conveyed the immense weight of the family's honor. He was an actor being pushed onto a stage to perform the most difficult role of his life, with no script and an audience that would savage him for any sign of fear or failure. For the bride, the only escape was internal. She retreated deep into the fortress of her own mind, a psychological flight from a body that was no longer her own. A sense of profound dissociation washed over her, she felt as if she were floating near the ceiling, a silent, bodiless observer watching the violation of a stranger who happened to be wearing her clothes. The magnificent, jewel-encrusted fabric of her wedding gown, once a symbol of her status, now felt like a ceremonial shroud. She fixed her gaze on a single, insignificant detail, the intricate carving on a wooden doorframe, a loose thread on a companion's sleeve, anything to anchor her consciousness and avoid drowning in the overwhelming tide of shame. Lending a surreal and perverse legitimacy to this entire proceeding was the presence of the castle priest. He walked with the procession, his face set in a pious mask, perhaps murmuring a prayer or holding a crucifix aloft. His participation did not sanctify the ritual, it made it infinitely more grotesque. He was the representative of God, and his presence implied divine approval for this public debasement. He was there to bless the bed, to ensure that this crude, almost pagan act of fertility was contained within the bounds of Christian sacrament, transforming a public violation into a holy obligation. Finally, the roaring human river reached its destination, the door to the bridal chamber. Here, the procession bottlenecked, the crowd surging and pressing forward, a frantic scramble for the best vantage point from which to witness the final act. The doorway became a frame for the stage, the threshold between the chaotic journey and the focused performance. The noise reached a deafening crescendo of anticipation. With a final, collective shove, the bride and groom were pushed across the threshold, a violent, unceremonious entry into the room that would serve as the altar for their public sacrifice. This was the bedding ceremony, the brutal, ritualized march to the scaffold of intimacy, and the entire world had come to watch them bleed. The most degrading chapter of the ordeal unfolded within the confines of the bridal chamber. The great wooden doors were not closed to grant the couple a final shred of privacy, they were thrown wide, wedged open to accommodate the crush of onlookers. The room itself, usually a sanctuary, became a public arena, a stage set for the night's final, brutal performance. The highest-ranking guests, the parents of the couple, powerful uncles, and allied lords, pushed their way inside, their entitlement granting them the choicest positions around the bed itself. Their presence was not that of supportive family, but of vigilant inspectors, there to ensure the contract was fulfilled to their satisfaction. They were the stakeholders, and they had come to observe their investment. Those of lesser rank, a chaotic jumble of knights, distant cousins, and high-ranking servants, jostled for position in the crowded doorway and the corridor beyond. Their faces were a grotesque gallery of human curiosity, a sea of expressions ranging from drunken amusement to a raw, almost clinical, interest. They craned their necks, stood on tiptoe, and climbed upon benches to gain a better view, their collective breathing a low, expectant hiss that filled the air. This was the raw, unvarnished truth of the feudal hierarchy. Even in the most intimate of moments, a person's body was not their own, but a public spectacle for their social superiors and inferiors alike. The ritualistic disrobing began almost immediately. It was not a tender or intimate act, but a swift, almost violent, public undressing, a final stripping away of not just clothing but of individual identity. The bride's companions, their faces flushed with wine and excitement, descended upon her like a flock of frantic birds. They worked at the intricate laces of her gown, their fingers fumbling in their haste, their nervous laughter a shrill counterpoint to the bride's stony silence. Each layer of clothing removed, the heavy velvet overdress, the fine silk chemise, was held aloft for a moment, a trophy presented to the cheering crowd before being tossed aside. Simultaneously, the groom was subjected to his own form of ritual humiliation. His friends, their camaraderie now transformed into a form of rough handling, pulled at his tunic and hose. Their jokes, which had been merely bawdy in the great hall, now became brutally direct, a running commentary on his physical attributes and the task that lay before him. The removal of his ceremonial dagger and belt was met with a roar of approval, a symbolic disarming before the final conquest. He stood, exposed and vulnerable, no longer a proud young nobleman but a piece of breeding stock being prepared for service. Every removed garment was a milestone in their degradation. The unveiling of a white shoulder, the baring of a muscled calf, each was greeted with a fresh wave of shouts and whistles from the audience. The bride's long hair, painstakingly arranged in intricate braids for the ceremony, was unpinned and allowed to fall, a symbolic gesture of her transition from maiden to wife, though in this context, it felt more like the shearing of a sacrificial lamb. They were being systematically dismantled, their public personas deconstructed layer by layer until all that remained was the raw, shivering flesh of two terrified strangers. When they were finally naked, they were momentarily frozen in the torchlight, two pale statues in a sea of clothed, leering faces. The sudden chill of the stone-walled room on their bare skin was a brutal shock, a physical manifestation of their utter vulnerability. They stood exposed not to the cold, appraising eyes of the assembled families, a stark and brutal assessment of the human assets being exchanged. Their youth, their health, their potential for breeding, it was all laid bare for inspection. And in that moment, shivering in the draughty chamber, they were no longer a lord and a lady, but simply a male and a female, stripped of everything but their biological function. Then, with the same rough ceremony, they were pushed towards the bed and forced onto the cold linens. The mattress, stuffed with straw or feathers, rustled loudly, another sound in the symphony of their degradation. At this point, the priest might step forward, a solemn figure amidst the drunken revelry, to perform a final, grotesque blessing. He would sprinkle the bed, and the naked, trembling bodies within it, with holy water, the cold droplets a shocking sensation on their skin. He would murmur Latin prayers for fertility and the begetting of legitimate heirs, the sacred words a bizarre and jarring accompaniment to the profane spectacle unfolding. This act was the ultimate hypocrisy, a holy seal placed upon an act of profound, public violation. Once the blessing was complete, the final piece of the stage was set. With a great flourish, the heavy curtains of the four-poster bed were drawn shut by the mothers of the couple. But this was no gesture of mercy, no granting of privacy. The fabric, often a fine linen or thin brocade, was chosen specifically to be translucent. It veiled the scene but did not hide it. In the flickering torchlight, it transformed the couple into indistinct, writhing silhouettes, a shadow play for the rapt audience. The curtains served only to heighten the voyeuristic tension, turning the bed into a puppet theater where the most intimate of human acts would be performed by anonymous, shadowy figures. The character of the noise in the room shifted. The loud, boisterous cheering subsided, replaced by a more intense, focused susurrus of whispers, shuffling feet, and the clinking of goblets. The audience pressed closer to the bed, their bodies forming a dense, breathing wall around the central drama. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, were glued to the translucent fabric, interpreting every shadow, every movement. Wagers were whispered, crude analyses of the performance were exchanged in low tones. The air grew thick with a collective, concentrated voyeurism, the focused energy of a crowd watching a gladiator match, waiting for the first sign of blood. Inside the claustrophobic confines of the bed, the world was reduced to a suffocating nightmare. The air was stale and quickly became thick with the scent of their own fearful sweat. Through the thin curtain, the faces of the crowd were a distorted, menacing blur, their eyes glowing like embers in the torchlight. The whispers from outside were a constant, tormenting murmur, an inescapable reminder that they were being watched, judged, and commented upon. The coldness of the sheets felt like a shroud, and the unfamiliar body of the stranger lying beside them was not a comfort, but a source of profound, alien terror. For the groom, the pressure was immense, a physical weight crushing down on him. Every whispered joke he had endured, every encouraging slap on the back, now coalesced into a single, overwhelming demand: perform. His family's honor, the validity of the marriage contract, and his own reputation as a man rested entirely on his ability to conquer his fear and the debilitating effects of the wine he had been forced to drink. He was no longer a husband, he was the dynasty's champion, and this bed was his tournament field. Failure would be a public disgrace from which he might never recover. For the bride, the experience was one of utter and complete powerlessness. This was not a union, it was an invasion. She was the territory to be conquered, the vessel to be filled. Her role was to be passive, to endure, to submit to a painful and terrifying ordeal for the good of her family. Any resistance would be seen not as a defense of her own person, but as a rebellious betrayal of her duty. Her only possible escape was to mentally detach, to send her consciousness far away from the cold sheets and the fumbling, unfamiliar hands, to a place where the sounds from beyond the curtain could not reach her. She was a living sacrifice on the altar of a political alliance. The audience, meanwhile, remained rapt. They listened for every sound from within the veiled space, the rustle of linens, a sharp intake of breath, a muffled cry that could be interpreted as either pain or passion. These sounds were the only narrative they had, and they consumed it greedily. The fathers of the couple stood rigid, their faces grim, their political fortunes hanging on the successful completion of this biological act. The mothers, who had endured this same ritual themselves a generation ago, watched with a complex mixture of pity and hardened pragmatism. This was the brutal, unchanging currency of their world, and their children were now paying the price. Behind the translucent veil of the bed curtains, in a suffocatingly small and intimate space made infinitely smaller by the psychic weight of the crowd beyond, the central drama unfolded. This was the raw, unscripted heart of the entire wedding ceremony, a moment of profound biological and political significance stripped of all poetry. The air within the enclosure was a hot, foul mixture of the couple's own fearful sweat, the lingering scent of wine on their breath, and the heavy, dusty smell of the bed linens. It was a claustrophobic pocket of reality, a world reduced to the size of a mattress, yet paradoxically exposed to the entire world outside. The whispers and shuffling feet of the audience were a constant, tormenting presence, a soundtrack of incessant judgment that seeped through the thin fabric. From the young men, whose youthful confidence had been systematically eroded by hours of ceremonial drinking and the crushing, visible weight of expectation, a monumental act was now required. He was called upon to perform the most private and sacred of acts not in a sanctuary of love and trust, but under the relentless, dissecting gaze of a critical global audience. His fumbling, uncertain movements were not the tender explorations of a new husband, but the panicked actions of a performer terrified of forgetting his lines. Every hesitant touch, every awkward shift of weight, became part of a desperate, clumsy choreography dictated by fear rather than desire. The natural instincts of lust were smothered under a thick blanket of performance anxiety. The entire spectrum of human vulnerability was on display, transformed into a public spectacle. The groom's awkwardness, a product of his inexperience and terror, was interpreted by the whispering crowd as a lack of virility. The bride's fear, a natural reaction to this terrifying and painful ordeal, was read as a sign of stubbornness or frigidity. Her pain, an inevitable consequence of her first sexual encounter, was not a private agony to be soothed, but a required part of the performance, a necessary sound effect in the drama of her deflowering. There was no room for tenderness, no space for consent, there was only the brutal, mechanical imperative to complete the act and produce the required evidence. The crowd outside the curtains, meanwhile, was engaged in its own form of intense, participatory observation. They were not passive viewers, they were active listeners, their senses strained to catch any clue from within the veiled space. They waited for the telltale sounds that would narrate the unseen act, the creak of the bed frame, a sharp intake of breath, a muffled cry. Each sound was instantly seized upon, interpreted, and commented upon in low, conspiratorial whispers. It was a collective act of auditory voyeurism, a grim and intrusive piece of detective work where the crime was intimacy and the evidence was sound. Their hushed commentary was a constant, unnerving reminder that this was not a private union, but a public audit of a dynastic transaction. The most crucial piece of evidence the crowd awaited was the bride's cry of pain. This was a critical moment in the performance, the audible proof that her virginity had been taken. In the brutal calculus of the time, this sound was a confirmation of her value, a guarantee that the lineage had not been tainted before this moment. A bride who did not cry out might be suspected of not being a virgin, a catastrophic failure that could invalidate the entire marriage contract. Thus, she was trapped in an impossible position, she was expected to endure pain, and she was expected to vocalize that pain for the satisfaction of the public record, her genuine suffering transformed into a required element of the ritual. Following this, the crowd waited for the climax of the drama, a moment of stillness, a profound silence that would signify the completion of the act. This quiet, after the preceding symphony of creaks and cries, would be the signal that the deed was done, the conquest complete. And this silence was expected to be broken, not by a tender whisper between the couple, but by a triumphant shout from the groom or one of his companions who had been peering most intently through the curtains. This cry of victory was the official announcement, the verbal confirmation that the biological and legal requirements of the union had been met. It was the moment the tension in the room would finally break. And then came the final, most important act of verification, the presentation of the physical proof. The bed curtains would be thrown back with a flourish, once again exposing the couple to the full glare of the torchlight and the assembled crowd. But the focus of the audience would not be on the exhausted, shame-faced couple. All eyes would be fixed on the bedsheet. The groom's mother or another high-ranking female relative would step forward, her face a grim mask of purpose, and lift the sheet from the bed. She would search its surface for the telltale stain, the small patch of blood that was the ultimate, irrefutable proof of consummation. This stained cloth was the true prize of the entire wedding. It was the physical manifestation of the alliance, a tangible symbol that the bride's purity had been sacrificed, the groom's duty had been performed, and the two families were now irrevocably bound by blood. The sheet would be held aloft, displayed to the cheering crowd like a captured battle standard, the dark stain a heraldic device signifying the successful merger of two dynasties. This final, public display was the ultimate act of humiliation, the transformation of a profoundly intimate and personal moment into a piece of public property, a bloody trophy to be celebrated and recorded for posterity. Yet, behind the officially sanctioned narrative of triumphant consummation, a far more cynical and pragmatic reality often lurked. The triumphant display of the blood-stained sheet was the desired outcome, the perfect conclusion to the public drama, but it was not always an authentic one. The immense, multifaceted pressure exerted on the young couple, the suffocating presence of the crowd, the crippling weight of dynastic expectation, and the debilitating effects of alcohol, created a perfect storm for failure. Performance anxiety was not a rare exception, it was an almost inevitable consequence of the ritual's brutal and unnatural conditions, a common and deeply feared complication. What happened, then, when the young husband, paralyzed by a potent cocktail of fear, inexperience, and intoxication, found himself unable to perform his crucial duty? The entire edifice of the alliance, so painstakingly constructed through months of negotiation, was suddenly poised on the brink of collapse. Annulment was a real and catastrophic possibility. The family's honor, a fragile and priceless commodity, would be irrevocably tarnished. The bride's reputation, and by extension her family's, would be ruined. In this high-stakes environment, failure was not an option that could be acknowledged. The performance simply had to have a successful conclusion, even if it required a secret, well-rehearsed deception. This is where the cold, calculating pragmatism of the matriarchs came into play. An experienced and trusted lady-in-waiting, a midwife, or even the groom's own mother, would be prepared for this very contingency. It was an unspoken but essential part of their role as guardians of the family's interests. While the main drama unfolded behind the bed curtains, a secret and far more subtle performance was taking place in the shadows of the chamber. This woman, a figure of unimpeachable discretion, would have a contingency plan ready, a piece of theatrical magic designed to save the honor of the house from the fumbling inadequacy of its heir. The instrument of this deception was simple, crude, but brutally effective. Concealed within the folds of her voluminous dress, the accomplice would be carrying a small, prepared device. It was often the bladder of a sheep or a pig, carefully cleaned and filled with the fresh, still warm blood of an animal, a chicken or a pigeon, that had been discreetly slaughtered in the castle kitchens just hours before. In some cases, a small sponge soaked in the blood and hidden in a locket or pouch would serve the same purpose. This was the secret prop in the night's most important piece of theater, a tool to manufacture the evidence that nature had failed to provide. At the critical moment, when it became clear to the desperate couple or the keen-eyed observers that the consummation was not going to happen, a silent signal would be passed. A specific cough from the groom's father, a subtle hand gesture from a watchful aunt, these were the cues for the deception to be initiated. The trusted accomplice would then approach the bed under the guise of offering the bride a fortifying drink of wine or adjusting her pillows. Her movements would be swift, practiced, and almost invisible in the dimly lit, chaotic atmosphere of the chamber. She was a ghost in the machine, her true purpose known only to a select, powerful few. In the confusion and the semi-darkness behind the curtains, she would pass the hidden bladder or sponge to the groom. It was now his task to complete the deception. With a surge of desperate relief, he would discreetly break the bladder or squeeze the sponge, releasing the animal blood onto the pristine white sheet. The act required a degree of nerve and dexterity, but it was a far less daunting prospect than the biological performance he had failed to achieve. He was no longer a failed husband, but a desperate conspirator in a plot to save himself and his family from public ruin. The bride, a silent and terrified party to this fraud, had no choice but to play her part. She might be instructed to feign a cry of pain at the appropriate moment, a sound that would now be a pure performance, a lie to corroborate the visual lie being created on the sheets beneath her. Her complicity was non-negotiable. She was as invested in the success of the deception as everyone else, for her own future and reputation were equally at stake. Her body may have been spared the physical ordeal of a forced consummation, but it was now the centerpiece of a calculated and deeply cynical fabrication. Once the false evidence had been planted, the rest of the ritual could proceed as planned. The triumphant shout, the drawing back of the curtains, the solemn inspection of the sheet, it all unfolded with the same theatrical gravity. But now, it was a complete charade. The cheers of the crowd were for a victory that had never been won. The proud, satisfied nods of the fathers were an endorsement of a successful deception. The blood-stained sheet, held aloft for all to see, was not a symbol of a consummated union, but a monument to a desperate, pragmatic lie. And so, the great dynastic alliance, a union that might go on to shape the political map of a kingdom for generations, would be founded not on the sacred and biological reality of a consummated marriage, but on a carefully staged illusion. The future of a noble house, the legitimacy of its heirs, and the course of history itself could, in the end, rest upon the spilled blood of an anonymous, unremembered animal. This was the ultimate, hidden truth of the bedding ceremony. When honor and reality came into conflict, it was reality that was quietly, efficiently, and ruthlessly sacrificed on the altar of appearances.